Alright, I hate when people on YouTube withhold things, so I'm going to go ahead and say, yes, the build is fine. Hello and welcome, and happy Patch Notes Day. If you, like me, were watching live stream and wondering how it was going to impact your plan build for 321, it was probably an interesting day full of theory crafting. After looking over the patch notes pretty closely, I've come to the conclusion that it's not that bad. And in fact, with the weapon trees that are coming as part of Crucible, I expected to hit a higher DPS ceiling in 321 than I did in 320. There were some nerfs, and parts of the build will have to change to accommodate the loss of Perfect Crime, and some of the significant changes in masteries which do affect us, but all in all, it's perfectly reasonable. Over the last couple weeks, and today in particular, I've been playtesting League Start versions of the build that start from the ground up as a Trickster. So the moment you walk into Lionized Watch, you're going to grab Explosive Trap and go from there, level 2 on. Here's a version of that all the way in endgame. I estimate it costs between 8 and 9 div. It uses 0 expensive items and only a single crafted scepter, and not even the full. It doesn't need to be a trigger scepter like the previous one. So you just need a +2 gem scepter on a fractured base, a couple inexpensive small clusters. The chaos cluster is small clusters, a single inexpensive mana reservation cluster, and
catch my breath.
one large fizz cluster. I'm using a lethal pride to help meet strength requirements. It's not strictly necessary. You can roll it on your gear, but it's probably cheapest just to get a lethal pride. Those, again, not expensive on league, even on league start. And yeah, I'm still using Divine Blessing here to cast Haste and Zealotry. And with Zealotry, this version of the build has around 25 million DPS. Haste is also available and makes for a pretty fast mapper on a budget. As you can see, we're still quite fast. This version of the build uses Life Tap to mitigate the costs, so that we can still use Energy Shield as a defensive layer, and it scales really well into the end game. You could take on all Ubers with it with a bit more investment. I've killed Uber Shaper with this build. I haven't done the others yet, but I'll probably test those after I do a little more League Start testing. Again, this is not reliant on Perfect Crime. It's not reliant on any of the reservation masteries that we lost in the patch notes, and there are reasonable alternatives for all of the things that were nerfed in the masteries. So let's go over a few of them. So let's start with the nerfs. The biggest one is Arcane Surge. So Arcane Surge straight up lost all of its more spell damage. Instead of more spell damage, it now reads cast speed, and that is a brick for us. So that's a flat 10% gone, and there's not a lot we can do to offset that. It means Arcane Pyrotechnics isn't something that you want as notable in your medium cluster anymore, and that's just kind of sad. The next is Perfect Crime. Perfect Crime was really important as a Forbidden Flame and Flesh Jewel because it provided 25% mana cost reduction, and it's no longer available. Perfect Crime has been changed, and it's no longer helpful for us. So there is a way that we can offset this, and quickly I'll touch on it. It's switching your boot enchant over to the 18% mana cost reduction if you've been hit recently, which using Forbidden Rite we've always been hit recently, and then pairing that with a different Forbidden Flame and Flesh Jewel, which I'll go over in a minute. We've also lost all the masteries for mana reservation, which is kind of a bummer on the surface. We use Grace and we use the Skitterboss one for 50%, but they added a new mastery in the mana wheel for 12% RMR, which actually offsets it and slightly boosts our mana available to us because we're not stacking a ton of these. In my endgame version of the POB, it goes from 35 available mana up to 42, so this is sort of a net neutral thing all in all. And the other thing that is pretty big for us that we've lost is 40% increased effect of non-damaging ailments. So this was really nice for helping us hit crit cap with 6% brittle, especially on lower, earlier damage versions of the build. Okay, let's talk about things that got better for us. First off, and I mentioned this earlier, but there is a slight boost to our mana available to us. In the endgame version of the build, it spends mana up from 35 to 42 with the new mana wheel reservation of 12%. The suppress wheel has a really nice looking node that I'm excited to try out, which is 12%. Oops, this is the removals. Let's go to the new stuff. There we go. Inflict fire, cold, and lightning exposure on enemies when you suppress their spell damage. This looks awesome. Right now we use, on my endgame build, there is a glove implicit for fire, and there is a scepter for cold. So having these just whenever we suppress spell damage looks pretty sweet, especially on Uber bosses, which you need spell suppression on. The next thing is the new protection wheel. There is a note on there that reads, damaging ailments cannot be inflicted on you while you already have one. Non-damaging ailments cannot be inflicted on you where you already have one. As a self-chill build, this means that we have virtual immunity to Scorch, Shock, Sap, Brittle, and Freeze. You don't need the Freeze Pantheon. You don't have to worry about Scorch and Shock, both of which are quite dangerous. This looks pretty amazing. I'm actually really stoked for this one. And I'll also say we lost the Trap Reservation Skitterbot's Reservation in the Trap Mastery, but we gained this one. This one actually looks pretty good. It looks like a flat 8% more damage. I need to do some testing with it once the league starts with Sunblast, but my expectation is that this will work, and it'll be it might be one of the better nodes available to us. 8% is a lot. And then the last thing I'm going to touch on is nerfs to leveling, which virtually everybody got. Arcane Surge being gone is just really sucks. It's something I always use to help speed up leveling. Vendoring a wand has now been removed, and I get why it's such a strong thing to have, 2 to 21 lightning damage added to spells when the added lightning damage support at level 1 is like 1 to 10. So I get why they did it. It shouldn't be worth 2 additional lightning damage supports at level 8, but man, that sucks. And then Explosive Trap in particular got a nerf when leveling. Oh, let's see if we can find it. Explosive Trap now causes, here we go, 3 smaller explosions at gem level 1, previously 4. It scales up to the same level it does at 20, so that's fine, that's great. But having 3 smaller explosions at gem level 1 means that you're doing less damage in early acts. This is going to slow us down. It's going to slow everybody down. We were not uniquely targeted. The vendor wands and Arcane Surge are a way bigger deal than this, I think. I'm going to have to do some more league start testing to see what it feels like to level the build all the way. But it feels totally fine to do so without Arcane Surge. And I plan on putting out a longer video with some league start tips and how to transition the build all the way into the end game using the life tap version that I leveled with that I showed you earlier, and then transitioning into mana, which has a higher DPS ceiling. Yeah, so that's it. I think it's exciting that they shook things up. I'm kind of bummed about some of the nerfs, and I know a lot of people are really grumpy about it, but yeah, thankfully we made it through without super huge nerfs to damage. Thanks, and feel free to shoot me any questions if you have them. Okay, because I promised at the beginning of the video, here is this league start version of the build running an invitation. It's rolled, I think, to 77%. I'm enfeebled, so I'm doing less damage. The bosses in this invitation are doing more damage. I think they're also turboed and extra proj. It's what I would expect to be running towards the end or towards the middle of the weekend, an opening weekend. We'll see how much time I have to actually play with family stuff, but yeah, the build is totally reasonable. I'm not using Perfect Crime here. I'm not using any of the mana reservation masteries. I'm using very cheap, easy to acquire gear other than Call of the Void, which I expect will probably be expensive on day 1, depending on how popular Self-Chill Spark is. So we'll see. I also am not sure what Sunblast is going to cost. It was pretty cheap last league. I think 5C on day 1 is what I spent on my Sunblast. So none of this stuff is expensive, and I think the build is going to be just fine. Anyway, I hope you all have a great weekend, and I'll have another video out soon talking about how to league start this. Take care.